While the world fixates on elections in Western capitals, East Africa's most stable democracy just collapsed in a matter of days. 2 weeks ago, at the Namanga border crossing between Kenya and Tanzania, smoke rose from burning tires. Tear gas drifted across international boundaries. Protesters fled Tanzanian security forces, only to have tear gas canisters lobbed after them into Kenyan territory. Trucks carrying agricultural goods sat rotting in the equatorial heat. The port of Dar es Salaam fell eerily silent. And across Tanzania's major cities, young people poured into the streets in numbers this so-called island of stability had never witnessed. Today, as I record this, the immediate chaos has subsided, but Tanzania remains under a state of suppression. Over 145 people face treason charges for protesting. Opposition leader Tundu Lissu sits in prison. The internet has been partially restored, but social media platforms remain blocked. Yesterday, November 11th, authorities released some opposition figures on bail, a tactical move that changes nothing about the fundamental crisis gripping the nation. What unfolded in late October wasn't just another disputed African election. This was the complete unraveling of Tanzania's carefully cultivated reputation as East Africa's anchor of peace. And the ripple effects are threatening to destabilize one of the world's most economically dynamic regions. The question isn't whether this matters to Africa's future. The question is why the international community that claims to champion democracy remains so conspicuously silent. Let me be crystal clear from the outset. What happened in Tanzania on October 29, 2025, was not an election. It was a coronation wrapped in the hollow rituals of democratic theater. President Samia Suluhu Hassan didn't win 97.66% of the vote through the will of the people. She won it by systematically dismantling every pillar that makes an election credible, and then deployed state violence when Tanzanians dared to protest this brazen theft of their political voice. This isn't about defending corrupt dictators or excusing authoritarian overreach. Any honest advocate for African sovereignty must distinguish between leaders who genuinely serve their people's interests and those who merely serve their own power. Hassan's actions have placed her firmly in the latter category, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the millions of Tanzanians demanding accountability. Here's what actually transpired in the months leading to October 29th. Tundu Lissu, leader of the opposition Chadema party and Hassan's most formidable challenger, was arrested in April and charged with treason. His crime? Calling for electoral reforms on social media and YouTube, not inciting violence, not threatening national security, simply demanding the basic framework that would allow Tanzanians to exercise genuine choice at the ballot box. He remains imprisoned today, facing charges that even sympathetic observers recognize as politically motivated persecution. The entire Chadema party, Tanzania's main opposition force, was then disqualified from participating in the election. The pretext was their alleged failure to sign an electoral code of conduct document. Think about that deliberate choreography. Arrest the opposition leader, charge him with treason for advocating reforms, then disqualify his entire party on a bureaucratic technicality. The Independent National Electoral Commission, which orchestrated this disqualification, is anything but independent. It functions as an extension of Hassan's ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi party, the CCM, which has governed Tanzania in various iterations since independence in 1961. But Hassan wasn't finished. Luhaga Mpina, the presidential candidate from ACT Wazalendo, Tanzania's second-largest opposition party, was also barred from the race. Initially cleared to run, the Electoral Commission reversed its decision just weeks before the election, citing supposed procedural violations during his party's primaries. The pattern is unmistakable. Eliminate every viable challenger, leaving only minor party candidates with no realistic chance of mobilizing national support. The pre-election period witnessed what Amnesty International characterized as a wave of terror. Human Rights Watch documented systematic patterns of enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial killings. A United Nations panel cited over 200 cases of enforced disappearance since 2019. warning of an alarming escalation as the election approached. These weren't isolated incidents. They were deliberate instruments of state intimidation designed to suppress any meaningful opposition activity. Humphrey Polpol, a former CCM official who dared criticize Hassan publicly, was allegedly abducted in October, leaving behind a bloody scene that suggested violence. Kenyan and Ugandan activists who traveled to Tanzania to witness Lissu's trial were detained and later reported being beaten, tortured, and abandoned in remote forests. Social media platform X was banned. Critical digital platforms faced restrictions. Foreign journalists found their accreditation applications mysteriously unanswered, while those who were accredited faced harassment when attempting to cover campaign events. When election day arrived, the turnout at polling stations was conspicuously low, according to multiple eyewitness accounts. Yet somehow, the official results reported an unprecedented 87% turnout, with Hassan dominating every single constituency across Tanzania's 31 regions. For context, Tanzania's previous elections, even under the authoritarian Magufuli administration, never approached these numbers. The mathematics simply don't reconcile with observable reality. The protests that erupted weren't organized by opposition parties who had been systematically neutralized. They were spontaneous expressions of rage from ordinary Tanzanians, particularly young people, who recognized that their country had just crossed a dangerous threshold. In Dar es Salaam, Arusha, Mwanza, and Mbeya, demonstrators took to the streets. Some burned tires, blockaded roads, and tore down Hassan's campaign posters. Others set fire to government buildings. The response from state security forces was devastating. Here's where the death toll becomes contentious and demands careful examination. The opposition, Chadema Party, initially claimed approximately 700 deaths, later raising that figure to between 1,000 and 2,000 as their monitors gathered reports from hospitals and health clinics across 8 regions. They've also alleged that police disposed of over 400 bodies at undisclosed locations, preventing families from recovering their loved ones. These are staggering numbers that, if confirmed, would make this the deadliest election in Tanzanian history by an enormous margin. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported credible evidence of at least 10 deaths in Dar es Salaam, Shinyanga, and Morogoro. Human Rights Watch has documented specific cases, including a resident of Dar es Salaam's Temeke district shot and killed outside his home by men in civilian clothing while not even participating in the protests. The Secretary General of Tanzania's Episcopal Conference asserted that hundreds died, based on reports from Catholic communities nationwide. The African Union expressed being extremely concerned about reports of hundreds dead and hundreds more injured. Tanzania's government denies using excessive force and provides no official death toll. Foreign Minister Mahmoud Thabit Kombo dismissed the opposition's figures as hugely exaggerated and claimed only very few small pockets of incidents occurred caused by criminal elements. The nationwide internet blackout that lasted from election day through November 3rd made independent verification nearly impossible. When journalists attempted to investigate, they found themselves either denied access or unable to operate freely under the lockdown conditions. What's indisputable is this: significant numbers of Tanzanians died protesting an election process that international observers universally condemned as fundamentally flawed. The exact toll remains uncertain due to deliberate state efforts to control information, but the scale of violence represents an unprecedented rupture in Tanzania's post-independence political trajectory. Now, let's examine the international response, because this is where the selective application of democratic principles becomes most glaring. The Southern African Development Community deployed election observers across 27 of Tanzania's 31 regions. Their preliminary statement was damning. The election fell short of the requirements of the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. They documented incidents of violence, intimidation of voters, extremely low turnout, restrictions placed on observers, and an atmosphere so tense and intimidating that, in most areas, voters could not express their democratic will. The African Union Observer Mission, led by former Botswana President Mokgweetsi Masisi, concluded the election did not comply with regional or international standards, citing irregularities and the internet shutdown as fundamental violations. These African regional bodies, often criticized for being too lenient with member states, issued some of their strongest condemnations in recent memory. The European Union released a statement expressing concern about violence, fatalities, and the lack of a level playing field characterized by abductions and disappearances. They called for investigations into alleged human rights abuses and dialogue with opposition parties. The UK, Canada, and Norway issued a joint statement citing credible reports of a large number of fatalities and significant injuries, and concern about the harassment and intimidation that marked the pre-election period. But notice what's missing from this international chorus. Consequences. No sanctions packages, no suspension of aid programs, no coordinated diplomatic pressure, just statements expressing concern and calling for dialogue. Compare this muted response to the fury unleashed when elections in countries less strategically aligned with Western interests face similar irregularities. The double standard is breathtaking. Tanzania possesses resources the West desperately wants: vast reserves of natural gas, critical minerals, including the unique gemstone tanzanite, gold, and strategic ports that serve as gateways to landlocked Central Africa. The country has maintained economic growth projections of 6% for 2025, making it one of Africa's fastest growing economies. Western governments and international financial institutions have extended billions in concessional financing for infrastructure, healthcare, and education projects. The European Union earmarked €585 million in grants for Tanzania between 2021 and 2027. When your economy is expanding, when your debt servicing appears manageable, when you're cooperating on climate initiatives and critical minerals extraction, suddenly the standards for electoral credibility become remarkably flexible. This is neocolonialism in its modern incarnation: economic leverage wielded to ensure compliant governments, with democracy rhetoric deployed selectively when convenient. Where is the outrage that accompanied far less violent electoral disputes elsewhere? Where are the calls for economic isolation or targeted sanctions? The silence speaks volumes about the hierarchy of whose democracy matters and whose can be conveniently overlooked when resource extraction and investment returns are at stake. Meanwhile, the destabilization radiating from Tanzania threatens the entire East African region. At Namanga, the busiest border crossing between Kenya and Tanzania, violent clashes paralyzed movement for days. Tanzanian security forces fired tear gas across the international boundary into Kenyan territory as protesters fled. Kenyan authorities deployed additional police to prevent solidarity demonstrations and tightened security at multiple border points, including Taveta, Isibania, and Lunga Lunga. This isn't merely symbolic disruption. The Central Corridor through Tanzania serves as a critical trade route for landlocked Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda. When that corridor closes, the economic tremors reverberate throughout the region. Trucks carrying agricultural products sat stranded at borders as goods rotted. The port of Dar es Salaam, which typically handles substantial cargo for the entire Great Lakes region, effectively shut down as workers were ordered to stay home. Shipping lines began rerouting vessels to Kenya's Mombasa port, creating congestion and logistical complexities that multiply costs for everyone. Kenya's Trade Cabinet Secretary acknowledged the situation was impeding movement and curtailing investor confidence across the East African Community Economic Bloc. The internet blackout in Tanzania blocked remittances, cutting off the $758 million in annual inflows that Tanzanian workers abroad send home to support their families. The Shippers Council of Eastern Africa warned of cascading delays throughout regional supply chains. Tanzania's stock exchange saw equity turnover decline by 66% in the election week. 57% bond turnover dropped. These aren't abstract statistics. They represent capital flight, investment hesitation, and the economic costs of political instability spreading like contagion through interconnected regional markets. But the implications extend beyond immediate economic disruption. East Africa faces elections in Uganda in January 2026 and Kenya in 2027. Both countries have their own authoritarian tendencies, with Uganda's Yoweri Museveni having held power since 1986, and Kenya's William Ruto facing criticism for his own government's handling of recent Gen Z-led protests. Tanzania's crisis presents both a cautionary tale and, perversely, a potential template. If Hassan can blatantly rig an election, deploy lethal force against protesters, face international condemnation, and ultimately face no meaningful consequences while remaining securely in power, what message does that send to other incumbents contemplating similar strategies? The regional precedent being established is extraordinarily dangerous. Youth populations across East Africa are increasingly mobilized, increasingly frustrated by unemployment, rising costs of living, and political systems that offer no genuine path to accountability. They've watched their Kenyan counterparts mount significant protests. They've seen demonstrations in Mozambique challenge that country's election results. The traditional patience that characterized older generations' relationship with flawed democracy is evaporating. Tanzania demonstrates what happens when that generational frustration meets a government willing to use overwhelming violence to maintain control. This isn't stability, this is pressure building beneath the surface, with no legitimate valve for release. When elections become meaningless, procedural exercises conducted in climates of fear and exclusion, the social contract fractures. Alternative forms of political expression emerge, and they're rarely peaceful. Here's what genuine African sovereignty demands in this moment. It requires African institutions and African leaders to hold Tanzania accountable, not as external interference, but as fellow guardians of the democratic progress our continent has fought to establish. It requires recognizing that Hassan's actions don't represent strength or stability, but the desperate maneuvers of a leader unable or unwilling to earn legitimate popular support. True sovereignty means African people determining their own leadership through credible processes, not watching power consolidated through intimidation and violence. It means African regional bodies like SADC and the AU backing their strong preliminary statements with concrete diplomatic action. It means neighboring countries in the East African community refusing to normalize these violations through business-as-usual engagement. The Tanzanian people have shown extraordinary courage in taking to the streets despite knowing the potential consequences. They deserve solidarity from fellow Africans who recognize that the struggle for genuine self-determination is collective. When one country's democracy is stolen, it diminishes democratic possibilities throughout the region. And for those in the international community genuinely committed to supporting African agency rather than merely extracting African resources, now is the moment to demonstrate that commitment means something. The same countries that rush to condemn electoral irregularities when they threaten Western geopolitical interests must apply consistent standards when the victims are Tanzanian citizens and the perpetrator is a government with whom they maintain profitable relationships. Tanzania's crisis is far from over. Hassan was sworn in on November 3rd at a closed ceremony held on military grounds rather than the traditional public stadium venue, a telling indication of her government's insecurity. Universities remained closed for over a week. The internet, while partially restored on November 3rd, continues to face restrictions on social media platforms. Over 145 people have been charged with treason, and at least 170 others with criminal conspiracy in connection with the protests. Yesterday, November 11th, 4 senior Chadema officials were released on bail after being detained, but opposition leader Tundu Lissu remains behind bars, facing treason charges that he'll likely carry for years. What happens next will determine whether Tanzania returns to some semblance of its former stability or descends further into authoritarian control with periodic eruptions of unrest. It will shape whether East Africa's democratic trajectory continues its concerning slide toward competitive authoritarianism, or whether regional actors marshal the political will to reverse that trend. This matters for every African who believes our continent deserves governance systems that actually serve our people, rather than merely enriching those who control the state apparatus. It matters for everyone who recognizes that Africa's development potential depends fundamentally on creating political environments where talent can flourish, criticism can be voiced, and leadership can be peacefully changed when it fails to deliver. The question isn't whether Tanzania will ultimately resolve this crisis. The question is, how many more lives will be lost, how much more regional instability will be generated, and whether the international community's professed commitment to democracy will finally translate into meaningful action, or whether it remains merely rhetorical cover for continued exploitation. If you believe African sovereignty means more than watching our leaders oppress our people, while foreign governments look the other way, as long as the resource extraction continues, then make your voice heard. Like and subscribe to this channel because every view, every share, every comment increases the pressure on those who prefer this story remain in the shadows. Ring that notification bell so you're immediately informed when we release the follow-up coverage this situation desperately requires. The Tanzanian people aren't asking for foreign intervention. They're asking for their own voices to be heard, their own votes to be counted, and their own agency to be respected. That's not a radical demand. That's the bare minimum any people deserve. And it's long past time the world started acting like African democracy matters as much as African resources. Share this video. Let's make sure Tanzania's stolen election and its regional consequences can't be conveniently forgotten.